very much. I'm thrilled to be in Edinburgh to get a different perspective on so much. And here is the reforms for donating to Syria relief for Aleppo, which is still in a tragic state. And in fact, it has become incredibly a byword for destruction, that people say, oh, Russia is doing in Ukraine what it's done in Aleppo, Russia. And indeed, even Syrian fighters are said to be volunteering to fight for Russia in Ukraine. And I'm talking on this vast subject, the Grand Tour in the Ottoman Empire. And please, if any of you know of portraits or pictures of the Ottoman Empire in Scotland or Scottish collections that I might not know of, please tell me. There are plans for books, exhibitions, and so on. And in fact, a lot of the pictures you see here are a product of lockdown evenings searching for new sources of pictures. And there's many more pictures of the Eastern Mediterranean than I ever dreamt of, from the 17th and 18th centuries. And one particularly arrogant generalization of the great Braudel was that the Ottoman Empire was an anti-Europe, was the contradiction of Europe, when nothing could be further from the truth. As I hope to show, first of all, in itself, it contained Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and was more international, more European than any other state. And secondly, it welcomed foreign travelers, really to an extraordinary extent. This is only the tip of the iceberg, what I'm going to show you now. And the Grand Tour was generally a period of 2 to 3 years for rich young men and occasionally women to travel. And it's generally been considered to have been dominated by Italy. But in fact, as I hope to show, many brave travelers went on from Italy as a natural progression. They got a boat from the port of Rome or Venice or Naples and moved on through the Greek islands to Istanbul and points east.
It always does this right at the beginning.
And Lord Winchilsea, a British ambassador in there, you see Turkey. I hope none of you need telling where these cities are. Istanbul, Aleppo, Alexandria, the Greek islands, Smyrna, the pearl of the Levant, Beirut, Sidon, Tyre, Cyprus. And Lord Winchilsea, an English ambassador at Istanbul, called it that famous city which for its curiosity and situation exceeds every other in Europe. See, he definitely considered Istanbul as part of Europe. And the three main motives for going there was power, to see the power and splendor of the Ottoman Empire, to be able to watch the Sultan's procession every Friday, which was much easier to watch than the other monarchs going to their religious observance. Pleasure, I'll be coming to that later, and scholarship. They were really very learned, brave people who wanted to see the ruins of antiquity. And as everybody here knows, nowhere has better ruins than Anatolia and Syria. And here you see a view, probably anonymous, of the school of Van Moor, but all this needs more researching. And Nabi, the Ottoman poet, wrote, "Heaven in vain revolves around all the world. It sees nowhere a city like Constantinople." The two banks of the Bosphorus were compared to a diamond between two emeralds, the jewel in the ring of universal empire. And empire is what the Ottomans were interested in, much more than nationalism. And one reason was scholarship. This is a view from a recent exhibition of in the Louvre And this shows a view of Athens in 1674 by a painter. Everybody is disputing who it was. And now he's called Anonyme de Nointel, because he was definitely commissioned by the Marquis de Nointel, Louis XIV's ambassador in Istanbul, who is this gentleman here. This is Athens, still an Ottoman city with minarets and mosques. You'll see it more clearly later. And these are some of the antiquities he brought back to France. And he said, oh, he was traveling around the Ottoman Empire to enforce the latest ahdname or capitulations agreement between France and the Ottoman Sultan, which Louis XIV, by the prestige of his victories in Western Europe, had won from the Ottoman Empire. But in fact, probably he just invented that as a pretext. He wanted the king to pay for his journeys around the Ottoman Empire with a really rather large entourage, brother, friends, staff, and so on. And you see how scholarship is at the basis of it all. He's bringing back these wonderful antiquities. There he is, a very good writer. He describes some of his entries into Aleppo and Jerusalem, building himself up, of course. It's not really known, but this would be a member of his staff. That's his brother. And here is a view of Jerusalem at that time. Also, School of Van Moor. Nobody knows yet how it was painted, a bird's eye view and so on, but pretty accurate with the Dome of the Rock, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the walls of the city. And here you see a view of Mecca. Ottomans themselves sometimes commissioned views of Mecca, and travelers would buy them in the Ottoman Empire and bring them back. This one, I think, is in the library of Uppsala University, brought back by, see how everything was linked in. Charles XII, King of Sweden, was an ally of the Ottoman Empire, of course, against the rising power of Russia. And so he has lots of agents going around the Ottoman Empire in the early 18th century. That is why there are some very good views in Uppsala. And here you see another Swedish view of Istanbul in around 1700. A view by Van Moor. These embassies are really cultural centers, research centers, as well as diplomatic centers. You see Topkapi Palace, the Dutch Embassy, and the Golden Horn. It's not moving. And you got a permission through your ambassador in Istanbul, or sometimes through consuls who would send messages to the Sublime Court, and this permission would say, let the bearer of this document travel safely throughout the empire. You can find translations in Byron's letters and so on. No, it's not. And most powers had, thank you very much, had an embassy in Istanbul. It's the center of negotiations. I quote a French diplomat, a center of minuscule and complicated negotiations, such as do not exist in other political headquarters, because it's a center of grand strategy and alliances against Russia or Austria, trade, of course, and religion, because of the holy sites, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and Nazareth, negotiations over that. And in addition to that, this whole world of the Levant in the Eastern Mediterranean, intermediaries between the powers in the Ottoman Empire, interpreters, merchants, protégés, baratlas, they were called, Janet and Paul know better than anybody about them. And swarming around these embassies. This is the Phoenician Embassy, 1741, painted by a Venetian military engineer. And I wonder if it's not very precisely painted just to show Venice, maybe to guide the navy if there's another war. And who goes to Venice at that time? I think inevitably Casanova does, and inevitably he describes it very well and very personally in his memoirs. I recommend reading them. And all these very grand embassies, very well paid. I will quote what a British traveller called Thomas Watkins writes, that with Sir Robert Ainslie, a great art patron, he was served 20 different wines after dinner, the most rich and rare of Europe, the Greek islands, Jerusalem, and the coast of Asia Minor, because the Ottoman Empire was part of the wine trade, as of every other trade also. Fruit, antiquities, people, and so on. The slave trade also boomed under the Ottoman Empire. And of course, Muslims as well as Christians, and everybody joined in, as you well know. And this is a quote from another visitor, 19th century. The soirees of the Russian palace were above all magnificent. Those of the ambassadors of France and England were distinguished by more taste and less richness, but the formal dinners at the Austrian embassy effaced all else. So there's happy days if you're invited. And they loved seeing the processions. Watkins describes the Sultan's processions to mosque, the most magnificent and interesting I ever beheld, the rich and various costumes, the beauty and furniture of the Arabian horses, the comely appearances of the janissaries and bostanges, or royal gardeners, whose singularly formed caps of scarlet cloth are particularly remarkable. In a word, the splendor, the novelty, and so on, really struck him. And that shows what travelers are looking for. They're looking for splendor and novelty and costumes. Here you see a view. I'm going to show you several views of the famous view of the Topkapi Palace, where the Golden Horn meets the Bosphorus, and then Üsküdar on the left. And this is in an English country house in Northamptonshire. This, I think, is the one by Favre in the Musée de Pera in Istanbul, a wonderful museum full of such pictures. It doesn't show them all. You see Mount Olympus in the background. You see the variety of boats, some naval ships, most trading merchants, and the small ones just for ordinary transport or fishing. This is the Ottoman Arsenal, the Tophané, and this is a view now in private hands that was at Ripley Castle in Yorkshire. So these country houses had or have some really remarkable testimonies to the Ottoman Empire and to the fact there were artists in Istanbul. And this may be by Van der Steen, a painter who has been rescued from obscurity recently, and he had different names, Jan van der Steen and so on, and he joins a group of British travellers, parts company at Aleppo, goes overland he had worked for the Swedish ambassador, then he joins British travellers, and he goes overland to India, and he dies a lieutenant in the Bengal artillery. That was what travel was like in the 18th century. And please note the bowing janissaries as the Sultan's procession goes past, the Galata Tower built by Genoese in the 14th century, which is still there, and again the number of ships on the Golden Horn. It was a great naval and maritime city, as well as a military, political, diplomatic, and commercial headquarters. This is another picture by Jan van der Steen in Amsterdam, in the Rijksmuseum. You see, this view is almost a cliche in the 18th century, very often painted. Presumably painters imitated each other. Presumably they were commissioned as trophy pictures to show you'd been to Istanbul. Here is a view of Istanbul. Again, the actual artist isn't precisely known. This is from Asia, from above Üsküdar. And here is a picture I took in the manor house of Bibi. These are embassy pictures done for the Celsing brothers, who were Swedish ambassadors in Istanbul in the mid-18th century, from about 1740 to 1780, and they were commissioning van der Steen, and they're showing pleasure parties going up the Bosphorus as the Bosphorus is becoming a resort for Europeans and Ottomans. And this is the Ottoman Palace at Beşiktaş, a sort of ancestor of Dolmabahce Palace. You see the bright colors which Ottomans painted the palaces. Christians had to have somber colors. And this wonderful collection, which had gone on in a Swedish manor house until 10 years ago, it was offered to the Swedish government. The Swedish government turned it down on the grounds that it was elitist, or so I was told, and it is now being bought by Qatar, and it is, I fear, locked up in the airport of Qatar. And when I asked if I went to Qatar, could I see it, I got a very hazy answer. Eventually it'll be shown in some grand new museum of a prestige project in Qatar, but nothing is certain yet. So Sweden lost an incredible joint collection, though the manuscripts have stayed in Sweden, but I don't know who has bought them, maybe the Central Archives or a local university. And the manuscripts again show how Constantinople was the center of European embassy. Letters are coming in from all over Europe, including Frederick the Great, because you had to get the Ottoman Empire on your side, or at least neutral, in order to win a war, a major war in Europe, as indeed you still have to get Turkey on side or neutral now. Here you see, as it was, this manor house. When I went there, I immediately thought of the danger of fire, but you see how views of palaces. This is Saadabad up the Golden Horn. This is the divans that they brought back from Istanbul, and professions or offices of the Ottoman Empire, which again is a sort of genre. Since Van Moor painted, we'll be seeing them later, a group of professions, everybody wanted something similar. Here you see a view probably of Büyükdere, which is becoming a summer resort for ambassadors. You see a European ambassador, presumably the Swedish ambassador, with local Christians in the garb. Gradually, these cities would develop into really quite major villages in the 19th century. Here you see the view of Beşiktaş Palace with the Sultan's kayak on the right. Only the Sultan could have 13 pairs of oars. When the French ambassador insisted on having the same number of pairs of oars, because ambassadors regarded themselves as equivalent of sovereigns, then the boat was broken up and he wasn't allowed to go on the Bosphorus anymore. And in a sulk, he refused to go and see the Grand Vizier after that. Because the machinery was so important, the French-Ottoman relations went on through intermediaries and interpreters. There you see another anonymous view of of Istanbul, with again the number of boats on the Bosphorus. Stuck again. And I just wanted to show and this is a view, I think, by Hilaire around 1780, later in the century, done for the Comte de Choiseul-Gouffier, one of the greatest ambassadors in the city. Here you see Hagia Sophia and Sultan Ahmed mosques and the palace. Each boat passing the palace had to salute it with cannon. That is another view of the Golden Horn. And that is a Barca panorama, some of these professional panoramas being done for the cities of the world around 1800. Here you see a view of Istanbul and the point of the palace, Saraybonu. A remarkable testimony to Ottoman civilian architecture, which is mainly wooden, probably because it was thought that wooden houses resisted earthquakes better, and there were frequent earthquakes. Start again. So that is the official background, the ambassador's background to these travelers in the Ottoman Empire. And now I'm going to show you the variety of the individual travelers who weren't necessarily ambassadors or diplomats. You see this very, very brilliant book. This is a second edition, I think, showing that the English are already there. Sir Henry Blount, 8th edition. So you see how, 1671, you see how familiar it is becoming with a Western public. And indeed, but by 1700, incredibly, people are apologizing for describing Baalbek because it's so familiar already to the public. And this is before they really know Paestum, which is far nearer, just outside Naples, or Split in the coast of Dalmatia. But the great temple of Baalbek is more familiar. That is Tavernier, painted in what I think is a fantasy costume by Philippe de Champagne. That's just been on the market in London. That shows again the frequency with which travelers, Tavernier, who went over the Ottoman Empire in the reign of Louis XIV. Louis XIV had agents going all over the Ottoman Empire, reporting on it for him, buying manuscripts, buying cameos, buying antiquities, moaning, oh, the British have already got all the best, and so on. And of course, observing, just in case the Ottoman Empire collapses, everybody is taking their positions, getting their information, just in case there's a slice of the pie for them. This is by Thévenot, another French traveler, 1673, avec Privilège du Roi, again in local costume. Another wonderful travel book, very lucid observations. In my opinion, the more powerful the Ottoman Empire was, the more objective or uncondemnatory the travelers were. It's when it becomes weak that they're very mocking and denigrating and scornful. And this is by a Dutchman who, of course, publishing in French because it's the international language of the day, going everywhere. And that is a jeweler of Louis XIV, a Protestant. His name for the moment escapes me. And he has to leave France after 1685 and the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, although he's familiar to Louis XIV, who personally would inspect jewels because he loved jewelry, and he goes to Brunswick or somewhere in Protestant Europe, and he dies on his travels later in the early 18th century. So the picture is now in Brunswick. That's no, it was Tavernier. That was his portrait. And many excellent travel books of his many travels, partly as a professional jeweler looking for jewels in Asia to sell to the courts of Europe. And this is Piton de Tournefort, another agent of Louis XIV. There is also the botanical grand tour, looking for plants. And he's going all over Anatolia, which then as now was a sort of, because of the climate, was particularly favorable. Par ordre du roi. It's a official mission paid for by the king. A wonderful description of Smyrna among many other places. Sorry. There you see again the view of Athens. And here is a view which has only just been discovered in a Paris flat by the same anonymous artist of Jerusalem, the same journey of the ambassador and his brother. And there you see the Dome of the Rock, the Janissaries who are guarding the ambassador at the ambassador's expense, of course, and some of his grooms or horsemen who are probably Christian Ottomans. And this picture, believe it or not, can be seen if you go to Oscar de la Renta's showroom in the Rue de Marignan in Paris. On the first floor, it's glued to the wall, and nobody quite knows its full history, but it was commissioned by Nointel. It hung briefly in the embassy in Constantinople. Then it's taken back to Paris. Nointel falls into debt and disfavor because he spent too much French official money. And then it sort of is sold and resold, and somehow the family that owned it hid it, stuck it to the wall, and then put something over it in the 20th century, probably in the Second World War. It's a great discovery, and it's a grand embassy going round being saluted and cheered by local Christians, and its message is probably, well, how wonderful France and French Ottoman relations are, really. But possibly it's to show actually the Catholics are top dogs in Jerusalem, not the Orthodox, as Peter the Great and Russia is becoming more powerful. The real war is between the Catholics and the Orthodox, not between the Ottomans and their neighbors. And let's forget the Venetians. They are also traveling, though in fewer numbers than the French and the British. And this is Antonio Bembo's travels with his uncle is Venetian consul in Aleppo. He goes through Aleppo and then overland, quite a common route, to India and then back again. You see, he goes through Persia, and his travel diary has been published, and it's wonderful. This is 1674 or 5, but it's slightly more conventional than French or English equivalents, which are full of jokes and lewd observations. The Venetians are more official and careful, and I wonder if that's to do with being a very solemn republic rather than coming from cities like London and Paris, which needed entertainment and had a very, or were more open-minded perhaps. And here is the state entry of a consul into Aleppo in 1675. This is drawn by Bembo's artist called Antoine Grelot, and you see the Europeans, the merchants in the city, and there were quite a lot of them in Aleppo through the 16th and 17th centuries, come out to greet a new consul entering the city, and there's an Ottoman military escort to show they're protected by the Sultan. And this is a whole system of interaction between countries and cultures. And here you see a view of Aleppo, 1675. I think it may be the first accurate view of the city, with the famous citadel, which is described as like a second sun shining on the city. And the mosques, this great commercial city where there'd been Venetians since the early 13th century, often the same families, quite grand families like Bembo, Grimani, Pisani, because I think you could make quite a lot of money quite quickly in Aleppo, because it's the center of the silk trade with Persia, among many other trades, and on the caravan routes from the Caucasus, from Mecca, from Iran, and ultimately from India. And travelers, Aleppo, and English merchants are the first from Aleppo, the first to rediscover Palmyra in 1691. And there is a Dutch artist in the city of Aleppo who paints this picture from their account, or maybe he went with them. You see the incredible abundance of columns and capitals, far more than there are now. It was really a breathtaking discovery at the time, reported in the papers of the Royal Society in London and later in much else. This is the King Charles XII of Sweden, defeated at Poltava in Ukraine in 1709, one of the decisive battles of Europe, by Peter the Great. And what does he do? He flees to the Ottoman Empire, and he lives in Bender, in what is now Moldavia. All these places will probably be fought over again. So he runs the Kingdom of Sweden from the Ottoman Empire, which that isn't proof that the most part of Europe, they didn't know what is. Messages go to and fro to the council in Stockholm. They're probably quite happy to get this very eccentric, warlike monarch out of their hair. Mm-hmm. And he also sends messengers and agents around the empire. And this is really it's not actually the beginning, but this is a strengthening of Swedish Oriental study. Here you see a Swedish officer who is drawing the headgear, the different headgear of the Ottoman Empire, Sultan, turbans, bonnets, marking what your office was in that very hierarchical and clearly defined hierarchy. And you see he's describing the pyramids of Egypt. This is about 1711 in French. The interior of Hagia Sophia. So, as travelers always say, Christians could go inside the mosques. Sometimes it was difficult, but usually it was really quite easy. And another view of the Palace of the Grand Seigneur in Constantinople, and it says drawn on the spot by Luce in, I think it's 1710. Sorry. There it is again. It's a real power center, center of magnetism, center of money. People were hypnotized by Constantinople almost as much as they were by Rome or Venice. And these are these drawings by Van Moor, a Flemish artist who came in the suite of the French ambassador in 1699 and stayed in Constantinople until 1738. And he spends his life, as he says, devoting himself to the study of the Ottoman Empire. These are the different professions and races of the empire. This is all in what's called the Turkish cabinet in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, because the Dutch ambassador in Istanbul bought them, and by the terms of his will kept them together as a visual encyclopedia. So this is a whirling dervish. This is a shepherd from Bulgaria. This will be a lady from one of the Greek islands. Each Greek island had its own costume. And this is a senior Ottoman official. This, I think, is a lady of the harem. This is another senior Ottoman official, and so on. So I recommend a visit to the Rijksmuseum to understand the Ottoman Empire. And Van Moor is there. We know very little about him. He was allowed into ambassadors' retinues to observe the reception of an ambassador by the Sultan occasionally. And he comes with the French ambassador, but he works for the British, the Dutch, and the Venetian ambassadors, and presumably many more. And hopefully one day somebody will do a thesis and a catalogue raisonné of all his pictures, because there are pictures clearly by him, and there are also sort of school of Van Moor which really aren't so good. This is Francesco Gritti, a great Venetian Levantine name, entering the city in procession in 1725. Please note the number of Venetians. People would queue up to join an embassy in Istanbul, obviously often at their own expense, just the opportunity to go with an ambassador. And the footman, that's particularly distinctive costume of a Venetian ambassador or bailo, which is slightly different. And the number of your staff and the rank of the Ottoman sent to accompany them was allegedly carefully noted in order to judge the prestige of Venice or France or Britain. And each ambassador always says, never before has an embassy been so honored as it has been since I was sent to such one. And it's all these rank and visual markers which fascinated observers at the time. And this is the Dutch ambassador, Cornelis Kalkern, the collector of Van Moor's pictures, who's entering the second court of Topkapi on his way to be received by the Grand Vizier and the Sultan. Again, he's Dutch people escorting him, 2 interpreters, one for the ambassador, one for the Sultan, 2 Ottoman court officials. And interestingly, in fact, there's only 1 column, but it's been aggrandized by Van Moor, the painter, to have 2 columns to look grounder, to make a better picture. And this is the famous moment when the Janissaries are fed the rations of the month and they're receiving their pay. And this was meant to impress the foreign ambassador with the number of the Sultan's elite force, the Janissaries. They're rushing for their rice, or their pilaf rather. So Van Moor, like some of the other artists I've shown, is a visual recorder of these very close relations between the Ottoman Empire and European powers. The Dutch were particularly appreciated as sources of information by the Ottoman authorities. They were thought to be more objective than other European powers. And here you see a famous picture. The 2 sons of the French ambassador are being received by the Grand Vizier. This is 1724. Monsieur d'Andrezel, I think it is, and the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha laughs and says he wishes to Louis XV a reign as long and successful as that of Louis XIV. And France and the Ottoman Empire are such good friends. He invents something because there was a marriage between the French royal family and the Ottoman Palace. That's not true. It's just a device to explain the alliance. And he says, if there is any difference between us, this is according to the French, it is only religion. So in 1724, religion is not regarded as all important. And also the number of Frenchmen accompanying the ambassador is quite extraordinary. They do have very good relations. There's peace, there's trade, so they are taking the opportunity to travel. And France is helping the Ottoman Empire and Russia and Iran to make peace at that time.
Put the oven on.
I was going to take this
Now I'm going to show you some
downstairs while I prepare things.
Ah,
Okay, you just go on.
because I don't know how long.
Oh, it says,
Sorry.
These are some pictures by Andrea Soldi of
it's 31 hour and
people in Aleppo.
this is now number
and nobody
39.
knows who they are
39.
exactly.
So 20 more minutes.
Sorry.
And
Photographs.
maybe somebody in the audience here can tell me. Frozen a bit. Anyway, that's been on the London market. This is a picture by Highmore of Ponsonby, who is a English traveller with Lyotard and with John Montagu, future Earl of Sandwich. They're travelling round in 1740 with William Ponsonby, later Lord Bessborough, and this is really the takeoff point for the English Grand Tour. They're very interested in observing the politics. He defined Ottomans as all who bear office in the seraglio. They applied my whole thoughts towards informing myself of the maxims and customs of the Ottomans. And he wrote a book about it, and he later becomes First Lord of the Admiralty, a very important figure. Studying the Ottoman Empire is a good move if you want a political career. And Sandwich later calls himself Sheikh Pyramidum and founds the Egyptian Society in London in 1741, open to any gentleman who has been in Egypt. And early members included Frederick Norden, another traveller, and many others. And he also, as El Fakir Sandwich Pasha, founded the Divan Club, open to anybody wanting to go to Turkey. And some of those portraits are in Brooks's Club in London now. And the artist who they found in Rome, Lyotard, stays 4 years in Istanbul, drawing not just places but people, and indeed local Christians. I think they brought, yes, that is Sandwich. I think they bought these costumes in Istanbul and had themselves painted back in London. I don't think they wore them on site because Christians couldn't wear a Muslim costume. I don't know what people in the audience think about that. And you see there's a mosque in the background. This is by Joseph Highmore. And this is this wonderful Lyotard picture done in Istanbul, the obsession with textiles, with incense burners and perfume sprinklers, instruments of music. And this is Mademoiselle Glavani of a famous Levantine family of Istanbul, still commemorated in a street name. She's dressed in Tartar costume. And this is Mr. Levitt, an English merchant of the city, dressed in local costume, a very sumptuous Ottoman costume. But he is probably wearing that indoors, but I don't think out of doors. And this is now in the Louvre. Really, Lyotard is one of the finest of all observers of the city. And this famous picture in Geneva of Richard Pocock, a great traveller, scholar traveller. It's the only leotard to show a bit of landscape, the palace. He's in a local Christian costume, dark, orderly, with a fur bonnet, not a turban. And Richard Pocock wrote a wonderful book, and Rachel Finnegan has just published a life of him, a life of somebody else, but she's published his letters back, which are not the same as the published book. It's very vivid, and he says how easy it is to go to mosque, how relaxed Damascus is. He can go to cafes when he wants, and so on. An Irish grand tourist. And that's his book, which I recommend. And here you see Leotard, called the Turk. It used to be called Going Native. He's grown a beard, and he's wearing a bonnet like the Christians of the Ottoman Empire. He comes back through Vienna and paints Habsburgs in Vienna. And this is a Madame Chenier living in Istanbul. That is her daughter-in-law. This is, again, the fascination with local. Obviously, they couldn't paint Muslim ladies, but they could paint Levantine ladies with a very sumptuous costume. This is part of the whole fashion photography which swept the capitals of Europe and the fashion market of Europe in the 18th century. And they obviously loved Ottoman music. And the Chenier family are French people living in Istanbul. A dictionary has just been published of the French of Istanbul from 1550 to 1800. It's enormous. It's hopefully there'll be a review in Cornucopia one day if a copy can be found. I've seen it in the British Library. This is a permission for travel. This is the one of the permissions you bought. I don't think it was very expensive. Through your ambassador, I photographed it in a wonderful exhibition on the treasures of the Holy Sepulchre at Versailles, which recorded the intimate relationship of the Catholic monarchs, and particularly the King of France, with the Franciscans looking after, for the Catholics, the holy sites in Palestine. And if you were lucky, you bought one of these embroidered envelopes and you put your document in it, and then you produced it to Ottoman officials as you're traveling to Beirut or Cairo or wherever. And the English Grand Tour is growing. This is now here, the Scottish Grand Tour. This is James Stewart, Athenian Stewart. He's in Athens in 1751, drawing the buildings, the antiquities of Athens, one of the great architectural source books of the 18th century. And you see here he is drawing, wearing local Christian costume, and these are two Ottoman officers observing his party, just in case they're digging up buried treasure. That's what Ottomans were also concerned for monuments, as we know from the Elgin marbles, but also about treasure. And who does he meet in Athens but Wood and Dawkins? This incredible picture in the National Gallery here in Edinburgh, painted by Gavin Hamilton. You see them rediscovering Palmyra in the distance, and they're painted as Romans because Britain was the new Palmyra, protected by the sea as Palmyra was protected by the desert. And they're living in the classical past as well as in the present. A very large party escorting them. And I want to know more about him. I looked at the picture yesterday. What is he actually doing? Is he reading a document? Is he maybe showing the permission, or I don't know. Anyway, there's the great arch which was destroyed in the 21st century. I don't know if it's been rebuilt. And these yellow boots, quite fascinated by Europeans. I think they were reserved for senior Ottoman officials. So again, Europeans would have themselves painted wearing them to show they're of equal status. But I don't think they did wear them in reality. And these are drawings by their artist. Every grand tourist, if they could afford it, would have a traveling artist with them. This is G.B. Borra, who they met in Rome and took on. So he's a brilliant architectural drawer. He also draws some of the sites of the Ottoman Empire, and then he comes back to England and spreads the fashion for Palmyra. That is the great temple at Baalbek, before there's been an earthquake which removed some of these columns. The largest single temple in the Roman Empire, it is said, possibly because the surrounding valley of the Bekaa was so fertile and rich, a temple of Jupiter. This is drawings by Borra, which are, I can't remember the word, of one of the cities of Anatolia, and another view by Borra of Istanbul. So I think there are possibly more panoramas of Istanbul than of any other European city. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something you had to draw. So I'm hoping one day there'll be an exhibition and the first room will just be panoramas of Istanbul. You can compare them. This is the book they published in London, Wood and Dawkins. Dawkins, as the caption in the National Gallery of Scotland points out, was from a slave-owning family of Jamaica. So he would have, the Ottoman Empire was also full of slave-owning families and slaves who you could hire. 1753, and then it's copied by country houses. This is Stowe, where Borra worked for the Marquis of Buckingham in the late 18th century, one of the great Whig powerhouses of England outside Aylesbury, of the Grenville family. He sort of practically ran the government as a family business. And this is a ceiling in Stowe. This is probably modelled on what Borra, who is working at Stowe, had seen in Palmyra and Baalbek. They were even sometimes called Palmyra ceilings. You weren't anybody until you had a Palmyra ceiling. And this is West Wickham, outside High Wycombe. Sir Francis Dashwood had been in the Ottoman Empire on a grand tour, but I have yet to investigate his travels. And this is his ceiling, also probably based on Palmyra. So you see the Ottoman Empire is inspiring, the travels in the Ottoman Empire are inspiring Western buildings. And this is Osterley outside London, and this may be based on the Temple of the Sun in Palmyra, built by Adam and changed over the centuries. And again, another very rich ceiling in Osterley, done by Adam, who had himself been to Split. And the Botanical Grand Tour, I'm sure there are people here who know more about it, but this is one of the many cedars of Lebanon brought back at the time from, maybe planted from a seed in the Ottoman Empire. And I think that maybe somebody here can tell me there's a society devoted to mapping the cedars of Lebanon in the British Isles. And now we are with Pars, 1765, This is a group of travellers sent by the Society of Dilettanti in London to draw and map the antiquities of West Asia, particularly around Smyrna and Ephesus. There was recently an exhibition of them in the Soane Museum in London. And you see the escort. Everybody had to hire an escort of armed men. And this is Parr's drawing in the Parthenon. And this is 1765. They were very intrepid travellers, taking many risks of plague as well as adventure travel. The mapping, the measuring the monuments. That is one of their escort. And this is how you travelled across the Menderes, what is called now the Menderes River, then the Meander River. See, they are wearing Western dress, and these mobile ferries, which existed within living memory. There's your party, there's Pars and Revit and others. This is a very vivid description how the party would travel. And of course, they would have a local Christian as an interpreter, a Greek or Levantine, or several of them. And this is Norden, this is a travel expedition sent by the King of Denmark, because it's not just English and French, but there were also Dutch, Danish, Swedish, and Polish travelers going around the Ottoman Empire, each with its own traditional itinerary. The Poles, for example, would start in Istanbul and end up in Italy, whereas the English would start in Italy and end up in Istanbul. Monsieur Niebuhr, you see, published for the King of Denmark, Imprimeur de la Cour in Copenhagen in 1773. And this is a famous early description of Yemen, Arabia Felix. This is Edward Wortley Montagu, the son of Lady Mary, who is a bit of a ne'er-do-well, I think. Tended to exaggerate his travels, but he lived a bit of time in Alexandria. This picture is now in the Koch collection in Istanbul. He lived much in Venice. And this is a Dutch picture of the port of Smyrna. A lot of people would spend time in Smyrna. It was called the Pearl of the Levant, or the Paris of the Levant, a huge trading port where Europe and Asia came shopping for each other, and where you could rest and get medical attention and so on. And this is a great Levantine picture. The artist is unknown. It's 1770. It's the Van Lennep family, Dutch merchants of Smyrna. That is the father-in-law who had lived in Ankara, so he really is wearing local costume. This is their children. This is the Mrs. Van Lennep, born Liefstap, who is wearing grand Levantine lady's dress. These are their two daughters. One marries a Frenchman, the Marquis de Chabannes, and one marries an Englishman, Mr. Waldegrave, later Lord Radstock. And this may be the artist, the French artist or tutor, who's part of the household. And one of them marries into the Moria family and produces James Moria, who wrote Haji Baba of Isfahan. So Smyrna as a place of cultural contact and exchange. This is the great travel of 1778 to 80 of the Comte de Choiseul-Gouffier, a Frenchman obsessed with Greek revival and classical culture, as was common at the time. And he goes with a great band of friends and artists, including Hilaire, and commissions a book of prints of his travels, Voyage de la Grèce. And again, you see Europeans and the escorts relaxing in the middle of Anatolia. Greeting a local governor, see they're offering presents to him. That is Choiseul-Gouffier in European dress. They're offering presents. Maybe here, you had to bring, there's a wonderful phrase by Byron, Turks are very welcoming, particularly if you have many presents with you. It's usually watches and guns, the latest mechanical inventions. And in fact, Byron goes on sending presents back to his Turkish friends after he returns to England. This is Milas in Asia Minor. Other places, halting places. It's an incredible book, Voyage de la Grèce. This is outside Smyrna on the coast of Anatolia. Hilaire's view of Istanbul. And this is in the Louvre, and it shows some of the antiquities which Choiseul-Gouffier is sending back to Paris. And incredibly, it was interrupted by the French Revolution. But in 1814, he finds that some of his antiquities are still in the storehouse in Istanbul, and he gets them finally to Paris. And you see the description, 1789. He's a very learned, erudite ambassador, but it does seem odd that France appoints 1784 as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire somebody who was pro-Greek already, and in fact made remarks about the Greeks overthrowing tyranny. But he was a favorite of Marie Antoinette, so I think that explains a lot. There have been exhibitions on him in France, but none that really does justice to his team of draftsmen, engineers, naval instructors, military instructors, a whole attempt by France to revive the Ottoman Empire as a traditional French ally and as a check on Russia in the 1780s. It's a sort of great dream of Monsieur de Vergennes, who we'll come to later. That's another Hilaire view of Constantinople, the Topkapi Palace. Again, another constant drawings of Constantinople. The courtyard of Topkapi Palace, just outside the Sultan's throne room. The incredible costumes of the solaks, or guards of the Sultan. The At Maidan, the old Byzantine hippodrome outside Sultan Ahmed Mosque, which is still there now. And he sends artists round the Ottoman Empire in the 1780s. This is by Cassas. It's the monument of Philip Pappas in Athens. Again, Cassas deserves a complete exhibition himself. He does all three of the great, he does Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, 1784 to 6. This is Greece, rather romanticized. You see the fascination with classical antiquity. This is outside Ephesus, local Christians. And this is Cassas's view of Aleppo, which has just been bought by the Museum of Tours. He's from Tours. Tours has a great collection of his pictures. You see the citadel and the mosques of Aleppo. and done from memory. He does several versions of his pictures. He's trying to make a living after he comes back to France. This is outside Tripoli in Lebanon. This is the Dog River on the coast of Lebanon. Different invading armies have put inscriptions. There's a book of prints of his pictures, as well as the pictures themselves. And this is Baalbek. Another view of Baalbek, rather romanticized. A view in Lebanon. So they're beginning to be interested in Muslim tombs. Palmyra. The artist with an Arab chief in Palmyra. So that they've learned to adapt to local costumes. And a meeting of caravans in Palmyra. The original drawing of this is with a dealer in Paris now. These are the tower tombs of Palmyra. Extraordinary record of how Palmyra was then. Another caravan in the Syrian desert, as caravans are crossing, bringing trade from the Gulf. A view of Jerusalem. A view, finally, they're taking notice of Crusader antiquities, which they tended to ignore before. This is Belapes in Cyprus. And the Sphinx. This is in Musée des Beaux-Arts too, I think, or the Louvre. Again, romanticized. And this is Jan Potocki, a Polish writer who writes about Egypt. So I'm going to go fast now just to show you the pictures. And this is, now we come to Luigi Maya, who is the British ambassador's artist, 1790. He's from 1786 in Istanbul, and 1792 to 3, he goes around the Ottoman Empire. He and his wife Clara Maya stays in Istanbul, and Brian Llewellyn and I are hoping to arrange an exhibition of his really extraordinary works, commissioned by British travellers and by the British ambassador, Sir Robert Ainslie. So here is the Bosphorus, Tarabya, a Greek festival, the port of Samos, the island of Samos in the Aegean, a temple in Samos, a bridge outside Smyrna, the theatre of Ephesus. You see the inscriptions in Italian are very careful, and he takes note of the local people and the conditions of the monuments, and he's, according to experts, he's archaeologically and topographically exact. This is Ephesus, the artist on the left. Sorry. This is outside Tartus on the Syrian coast, Phoenician tombs. Jerusalem. Some Muslim tombs outside Rosetta, a port in Egypt. A very curious sword dance in Egypt. So you see he's really getting to observe local life more than previous artists. And local Muslim entertainments. And the return of the ambassador, Sir Robert Ainslie, over the Balkan Mountains after his embassy in Constantinople. Ainslie himself had an incredible collection of antiquities and coins, and also hopefully will be in this exhibition on Maya. There you see bandits have been punished as they're leaving. On the whole, if you died on an Ottoman grandeur, it wasn't due to violence or banditry, it was due to disease. On the whole, the Ottoman Empire kept fairly good order. There were fewer highwaymen than, say, on some English roads in some years, even on the road between Kensington and London. And Maya's prints were very popular, and they were copied on Davenport and Coalport china in England. These are all views from Maya's books of prints that Ainslie published after their return to England. You see details like this. This is in fact a tomb on the southwest coast of Anatolia in Lycia. So it shows how popular the Grand Tour in the Ottoman Empire was. People wanted to read about it, to know about it, and to see images from it. This is a Dalloway description of Constantinople, and he uses the word tourist. And I think it may be one of the first examples of that. And this is Thomas Hope, great traveller in 1794 to 8. This is his picture by Beachy, done showing him in local costume and in Istanbul in the National Portrait Gallery, and a wonderful novel, Anastasius, I cannot recommend too highly, a description of Greek life, debauch, inter-community relations in a very wonderful, ironical style. And Byron wrote, the only thing I regret about it is that Tommy Hope wrote it and I didn't. And here are some of the drawings he commissions. I don't think they're by Hope, but his traveling artist isn't known. Again, showing interest in local life as well as in monuments. Dancing boys, that's a huge feature. Egyptian life. The convent in Athens, where he stayed and later Byron stayed. And that's where Byron met Niccolo. The Pompey's column in Alexandria, showing this miraculous ascent. I just don't know how they did it. So this is a very sophisticated artist. Hope hides his name and takes the credit. Interest in mosques. This mosque is still there in Akko. And interest in Ottoman architecture, the fountain that is still there at the gate to Topkapi Palace. Details. He didn't really work this up into a book, but he obviously intended to. He was after he returned, he becomes the creator of the founder of the phrase and profession interior decoration in London. So this is a unique record of the palace of the Sultan's mother in the Summer Palace, which no longer exists, on the coast of the Sea of Marmara. So they would have been able to see it when she wasn't there. Men could visit a woman's quarters if the women weren't there. One of the first Ottoman Atlases, this was sold last year from Sir Chevreul Sitwell's house at Weston Hall, for some reason through their family. This is probably printed in about 1801 or 1800, the first Ottoman printing press for maps, and given by the Sultan Selim III, who was very proud of it, to maybe an English officer who was helping him. This is a view of the Parthenon by a French artist with a masjid in the middle. This is by Monsieur Monsieur Fauvel, French consul in Athens, entertaining everybody coming through Athens. Pro-Ottoman, opposed to Greek independence, a great antiquities dealer who's selling things to everybody. That's at Egina. And that is the Arch of Galerius in Salonica. These are from a private collection. And there he is in his house in front of the Acropolis in Athens. He left in 1821, the beginning of the War of Greek independence, cursing Greek independence, which was upsetting his lovely life in Athens. This is by Louis Dupré, 1819. A view of Athens, you see what a mixed city it was. Even the Greeks, it is said, opposed Greek independence because it was doing very well out of all these travelers coming to the Ottoman Empire. This is by Dodwell, outside Athens. It's really accelerating the Grand Tour. It's becoming really in the Ottoman Empire because in the French wars of the Revolution Empire, Italy was out of bounds to many people. Again, the Acropolis. You all know all these stories as Byron in Albanian dress that he brings back with him. And it's now in Bowood. He gave it to a friend. That's Ali Pasha by Louis Dupré. They knew each other. And Ali Pasha said to Byron, "Oh, please visit me often late at night." And Byron said of Ali Pasha, he was the mildest mannered man who ever slit a throat. Never judge a man by manners. And it's a great classic descriptions. And even some people think that I don't really agree that English authorities in Malta persuaded Byron to go to Yanina, where Ali Pasha was trying to form an independent state, as a sort of bait for Ali Pasha to make him pro-English, because all Byron's books were in Arabic and he was planning to go to Syria. But suddenly he changed his course from Malta to Yanina in northern Greece, still with a lot of Ottoman architecture today. And the wonderful letters, wonderful poems about the Ottoman Empire, wonderful notes to his poems, which are very ironical, clever descriptions of aspects of life in the Ottoman Empire. He had many Muslim friends as well as Greek friends. And of course, he wants Greece to be free, but he's also quite scathing and skeptical about Greece. 1821, the rising starts. He doesn't actually go to join it till 1824. So it's not a great passion. It's a sort of considered step. This is some drawings by Louis Dupré, recently discovered, the original drawings for the famous prince, a Turkish imam and a Greek priest. This is William Henry Banks, who goes all around the Ottoman Empire after Byron. They were friends at Cambridge. And his house in Dorset, Kingston Lacy, has incredible records and antiquities from Egypt and Syria. And Dorset County Record Office in Dorchester has his papers too, and they haven't yet been fully explored. And there is the obelisk that he put up in his grounds, which is still there. The first obelisk to come to England.
Philip, may I just interrupt? We are running quite late.
Yes,
If you
okay.
can roll on, dare I say it, sorry.
This is more grand tourists. This is Coming Bruce, a Scot, with Baalbek behind him. Two travelers in Egypt. Egypt becomes a whole different travel object under the government of Muhammad Ali, who is very welcoming to foreigners. This is the Comte de Forbin, 1818, director of the Louvre. The actual director of the Louvre goes to Egypt, obviously, looking for antiquities. A view of Jerusalem. This is not a Ottoman, this is Alexandre de Laborde, a French writer in local costume. His son, who later becomes director of the Louvre, you see they knew the Ottoman Empire intimately. More travels. Ottoman tombs involves a growing interest in the Ottoman Empire. A house near Bodrum. A whole other source of these naval officers' records of the trips round the Eastern Mediterranean. And here we have David Roberts, who will end with David Roberts' famous views of Petra. he is. And so please, if any of you know of more pictures, please tell me. And I hope I've shown how quite normal it was to go around the Ottoman Empire. Thank you very much.
Thank you.